I felt these pages were a lot shorter than the other ones that we read. Um, but one thing I kind of wanted to invite in the circle as we start the discussion is style-wise, how much more European 18, 19, and 20, definitely the beginning of 18 got in the writing. For example, when I started, like, we were meeting slaves who were coming off of boats in Puerto Rico, and like the beginning of chapter 18, we're like car. So I don't know. I kind of wanted to open it up with that discussion and kind of how I feel we're kind of not transitioning, but we're almost like in a transformative space with the book as far as like time and just like tangible things are concerned. I don't know. What do you guys feel?
Can you say more about that, Brandon? Like, European?
Well, I mean, like, when I say European, really what I mean is everything that is kind of Western, the Westernized. Like the character.
They are coming to America now, so it is transitioning.
First time that I think a car is mentioned, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It opens with the Studebaker.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas before, all the chapters opened in nature, like literally in nature, in the woods, like coming off of boats, people riding bulls. I guess for some reason that kind of stuck with me, and I was like ready for that in each chapter. So when we got to chapter 18 and we're like in a car, in a pink car, like visually.
And in New York.
Yeah. So visually I kind of had to like, I don't know.
No, she's in Puerto Rico.
That's in Puerto Rico.
She's in Puerto Rico getting ready to drive to the airport to go to New York.
Yeah.
I was really struck after I finished that section on how much more colorless it was. All the colors changed, and that's something I don't often notice when I'm reading, but afterwards I was like, wow, there was no color in those chapters, not to the extent that there was before, and that kind of stuck with me. I guess that transition that she made to New York just took all the color out of everything.
Mm.
I think she even remarked when she was at the airport how there was lots of browns and grays. And, the character in and of herself, she remarked on, how there was just a complete change in the color that she was exposed to. So, yeah.
It really reflects reality because I go back and forth to Puerto Rico often. And when I'm coming back and I'm at Kennedy and I'm just getting on the highway, it's all gray, black and white. And when you get off, as soon as you hit the tarmac in Puerto Rico, the smells, the colors, the greens, I mean, it's like entering, I don't know, a different dimension. It's so different. So I think that she really was very successful in relaying that. The other piece that struck me is that those chapters, it was almost as if she was writing about my family, because that's what it was like for them. This was my family's experience. My mother coming in, on the plane, and her moving in with friends, as a roommate originally. That was her experience. The whole idea of you made it when you moved up to the Bronx. That was a big deal, the notion of when she talks about the apartment facing the park. My aunt lived on Fulton Avenue and 174th Street and facing the park, and the train, the 3rd Avenue L, for some of you who may not know this, there was a 3rd Avenue elevated train that used to come through, from 149th Street to Gun Hill Road. And we were used to that sound. So reading that, it was like, when did she come into my family? When did she experience all that? Because that was my family's experience.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah, exactly. When I read it the first time, I had the same feeling. I've heard all these stories in my
Vivi, you're dropping out.
always having, oh, it's, my phone is terrible. This, it's like getting the experience of coming from Puerto Rico to New York, and everyone having like a godfather sort of, or a godmother who they
Yeah.
helped you settle in, and then you moved up and you moved on. And it was just this cycle of families coming in and helping, this immense circle of support that everyone had.
I really enjoyed the independence and strength of Elena, like making that decision to pick up and leave, like not being willing to stay in a very constrained, oppressive atmosphere for her. And at that time in the 50s, to pick up and go like that was like very brave. And it reminds me of my mother-in-law doing the same thing from the eastern part of Cuba and going to Havana when, with her, you know, in order to remove herself and her children from a unsatisfactory relationship, marriage. But then my father grew up around that area, around Crotona Park, and of course in the 30s. And then my husband, that's where they came when they came from Cuba after Fox Street, and then going to Crotona Park was like an improvement over Fox Street. So in the same way that going from the Lower East Side and Brownsville was a step up for my grandparents in the 1930s.
I love the image of Elena in a linen suit and high heels. Like, I was like, oh, I just like, I want to hold that image. Like, that is so fierce. Like, she is in a pantsuit, walking out on like a very stressful situation, something that is not in alignment with her, and taking her children. I was like, wow, that's powerful right there. It's a really powerful image.
You could almost hear the heels, right? Clicking.
Yeah, I mean, so much. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that it also brought back a lot of memories for me. My mother was Puerto Rican, and she came with 7 sisters and brothers from Puerto Rico in 1945.
All together at the same time?
Yeah, pretty much. They had only one of my aunts, my tia Amparo. She's the only one who stayed, and she never ever came to the United States. Whereas the rest of my mother's brother and sisters, they all came pretty much at the same time. I mean, it was before I was born, of course, so I don't know exactly, but I mean, from the time I was born and remember anything, they were all there. And I was thinking about Elena doing that by herself, even though she came and she had one friend and stayed with them. I was just thinking that when we grew up, my mother, my aunts, my tia Consuelo, she lived with us. You know, my tia Carmen, she lived with us. You know, it was like, you can't do it by yourself. Yeah. And that experience. And so I was thinking about that. And when we were young, we went back to Puerto Rico, and I remember the propeller airplane, like the one that she was on, and how they described the propellers. And I remember that. I was probably maybe, 5 or 6 years old. And then I remember the second time we went, which was maybe 6 more years later, we went on a jet. And I remember that was like, wow. It was like, just like a whole new world of getting on a jet and going to Puerto Rico. It's just, it's just that chapter. I had to bring back a lot of memories for a lot of folks in the book club, because I think it was either us or our parents, who had gone through that. And it was pretty special, pretty significant.
Yeah, it was also the time of Operation Bootstrap, where there was a huge migration of Puerto Ricans into the United States. So that really shaped a lot of our families, and they would go from the migration. My family, they went from the Lower East Side to the Bronx, but then you had parts where they went from Lower East Side to Brooklyn or Staten Island. So it's been a really interesting dynamic to see how that migration just dispersed, not just over the 5 boroughs, but over the East Coast as well.
Yeah, the same. My parents, my father migrated here from Honduras in the late 50s. He met my mother, and they were both living in Harlem at the time. And then once they got married, they also moved up to the Bronx. That was like the promised land.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we all have that kind of similar narrative.
Yeah, my mother, I actually had a conversation with my mom. My mom is from Curacao. And she also told me about her story coming to New York for the first time. She had her older sisters were already here. She came when she was 17. And she had the unfortunate reality of coming during the winter. And it was the first time she experienced winter, anywhere. So she had the experience of seeing snow for the first time. And being really, really cold and having to shop for a winter jacket for the first time. And she told me that she, when she kind of went through that experience, that she really questioned whether she was making the right move, because she was like, it was so cold. And Curacao is just very, very hot and tropical. And she just didn't, she had serious doubts about whether she made the right move, but eventually with moving in with her sisters and having their support, she adapted. But the first time was really, really hard for her, and a very kind of jarring, in your face experience, having to deal with the winter. So I definitely related to that part in the book when Elena was kind of describing, and with her children having to describe, like, getting used to the cold, feeling the effects of the cold for the first time.
Yeah, that chapter was also really special for me as well. I think that was beautifully written, and the transition from this beautiful world to then this dark world was very, it made an impression on me, because I think it relayed the exact sentiment that Elena felt from leaving her world in Puerto Rico, going into this gray and black world that she's now experienced, that she's now looking and being part of it. So I felt that transition very vividly, like it was very real and very true for me. What the piece that also made a major impression for me is when she was in the airport and she was waiting for her friends, and I got really anxious reading it, because I thought for sure that she was going to be stranded there at the airport in New York, and that her friend wasn't going to show up. And it just made me realize that probably was the same sentiment that my parents felt when they immigrated to this country. And the feeling that a lot of immigrants feel when they're depending on either a relative or a friend to sponsor them, because I think at that time you needed to be sponsored, at least when my parents came here.
No,
Not for Puerto Ricans.
Well, yeah, my parents, yes, right. My parents came from Cuba, so I think they needed to, yeah. So, it was just, I could just imagine that it must have been, the feeling that she had. I actually started to feel anxious for her. And I said, that must have been the feeling that a lot of people felt about being in this country by themselves, with not knowing the language, not having any money, not having anyone to call or to rely on, and just, being there. I also felt that, because someone made a comment about, that she was really brave as a woman to come and do this, but I think she also communicated that there were many women. She spoke for the many countless of women who took that venture by themselves for whatever reason,
right.
Leaving their country or leaving their home to go into this unknown land. So she represented not only herself, but the countless of other women who've done that.
Yeah.
And who did it successfully. I really enjoy reading that chapter. And then there was a piece where she describes, because I remember my mom telling me that in the kitchen, there was a tub and they had to put a cup in the tub or something like that. And I was like, what? And then she didn't get into it there, but then my mom also told me that at that time they had in the toilet, the tank was up on the top.
Mhm.
Some sort
Yes.
of tank on the top,
Yeah.
and they had to hold the lever, right?
Right. The chain, the chain.
Yes, the chain. But I remember her telling me that they used to have to take a bath in the kitchen. I was like, what? You know, and so that was like, wow. It was, I felt that to be.
There are still apartments on 57th Street between 8th and 9th, just around the corner from Random House, that have that same setup. You walk into the apartment and there's a bathtub in the middle, and then you go into this little closet and there's a bathroom with a pulley over your head.
Are you serious?
On the
Yes.
Lower East Side also. On Rivington. Yeah.
In
on
Barrio.
almost- Yeah.
Yeah, in
Still.
Barrio, you see it.
Yeah.
On like East 100th Street, around there. Mhm.
La Cien, as they call it.
Yeah, en la Ciento y Lexington. Lexington Avenue.
Yeah, they used to live over there. Yeah, so
Yeah.
so that was a beautiful chapter. I felt.
But it was also kind of disturbing because Pedro, the husband, is making these decisions about whether he should stay with his wife or with his mother, which on the surface sounds so weird that you would want to stay with your mother after you're married. But
actually,
it's not so weird.
It's not so unusual. I don't know about other Latino, but in Puerto Rican, in Puerto Rican families, the sons, they like, the mothers are like, you know, like a goddess. You know, it's like completely dedicated to their mothers, and their mothers cook for them. You know, and they come to the mother's house to eat dinner every week, you know, every night. It's like, it is very.
Yep. It's, I call it the boca a mano, from mouth to hand. It's like they cater to their boys even after married. It's just the most bizarre thing. Machismo at its best.
But this almost ends his marriage, though. I mean, I can understand your mom being, you know, personal and really, you know, wanting to stay in her son's life, but to the extent where she overtly takes steps to end the marriage. Like, she doesn't care anything about his happiness with his wife. She's only concerned that, you know, he's the man. Either you be the man with her or be really masculine with your wife and put her in her place, which I guess is common among most cultures if we think about it.
But you know, I wonder, when I was reading that, I was wondering, they didn't really make it clear, but in Puerto Rico, if your son marries a dark-skinned woman and you're light-skinned and you wanted to lighten up the family, because that's something that's was very common. I don't know how much it is now, but it was very common that you were expected to lighten up the family. Yeah. And so I'm wondering how dark was Elena. I was supposed she was pretty dark, but they never really explained how dark Pancho was, her father. So I'm wondering if the mother-in-law's treatment of Elena had a lot to do with the color of her skin.
I didn't even think about that.
Me neither.
That's a good point.
I actually thought about that in terms of them coming to New York, because they were both so, Pedro and Elena was so discriminated against. And I thought about that because I think, like, from the story, like each of the couples, they kind of like grew up with each other. Like Concha, Antonio, you know, that's Elena's mother and her father. They were like, they grew up, they were in the same little enclave around from the house, from the former slaves. And then when Elena was going to go to school to be a nurse, she said, Pedro was her like high school boyfriend, you know, and so they were all still in that same little town, and they were both going to go to the city. So I assumed that they were both Black, Puerto Rican, and that in coming to New York, although they don't say it specifically, like they don't say about why the mother's so hateful to her, I felt a very strong sense that the reason they were being treated the way they were being treated was because of the color of their skin.
And the fact that they didn't speak English very well.
Right.
Yes.
I thought it was the fact that they did not speak English when they got to New York. I thought it was just a language barrier. And then I was wondering, like, maybe they're not being treated horribly. Maybe it's just a language barrier. And this is the author's way of kind of showing how people who experience that, like experience kind of culture shifts and language barriers, how they feel. Not necessarily what's really going on, but how it feels to be that person in the position that doesn't speak any English and is trying to communicate and can't. So I was a little confused there too. So much just got brought up that I started jotting down that I want to hear some more thoughts on. Ron, I think that's such a great point that you made about Pedro and his mother, because I didn't even think about that.
It was weird to me.
It was, but
Not
I didn't.
experiencing that. It was weird, but
Yeah.
it happens.
Do you know what I really?
Very telling. I think it was also very telling of, you know, that stuff happens, really.
Yeah,
That
no,
mother-in-laws
definitely.
can, you know, not to say mother-in-laws, but those kind of relationships exist between mother and sons, and a lot of it is culturally based, you know.
Yeah.
But that it's real, it's true.
Yeah.
It really is. So I just, when I read it, I just took it as, yeah, that's life.
That's just
somebody, either myself or somebody has experienced a situation like that, that there's this overbearing, too involved mother-in-law who, you know, cuddles and babies her son, and, you know, he can do no wrong. So,
you know, this is really opening a lot for me, because the whole time I was thinking that I was like, you know what? I think that this is actually a representation of, I don't know, kind of a manifestation of how Elena is being treated because she decided to go to school. Right? Would have stayed on the farm and did her magical duty, she wouldn't have had that beef with mom. I thought it was like I don't know, I guess kind of I tied it all back to her, like kind of transitioning into a more white life, as I call it, which is completely away from her ancestors. So she didn't have those ancestors to protect her. And that's why it was going down left and right for her. I was thinking of it like that, like she was almost like the curse of the race. But I think you guys are right. I think I was reading a little too deeply into it. One thing that I was
really independent too.
Yeah.
You know, I think it bothered her that it bothered the mother-in-law that she was fiercely independent. Then Elena was like, I'm gonna do what I'm gonna do. And listen, I know I have 2 kids that I have to take care of, but I think it really, you know, it bothered the mother-in-law.
There was a lot of anxiety for me around that independence, though. Who was talking? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I agree with that kind of that perspective. Just because there were so many instances where the mother, Pedro's mother, brought up her ego, brought up Elena's ego and how she had too much ego. So maybe there was, you know, she was feeling somewhat resentful, or she was feeling somewhat resentful because Elena was educated, that she struck out on her to get her education. So there was maybe parts of that kind of wrapped up in her anger. Not
subservient.
Not
subservient at all, right?
Well, there was a lot of anxiety around the independence, though, for me. Even though I wanted to scream like independent woman, there was a lot of anxiety around it, especially we can still talk about chapter 18 and I want to, but just in chapter 19, there was that scene where she was like holding the kids and trying not to cry while they were sleeping. And then she like kind of goes into writing and journaling, and there was just so much anxiety around this movement, right, that we're talking about, her immigrating to New York and like her moving in general. And I wonder, like, if that had to do with anything with her, with like, I mean, I hear you guys when you say it's like she wasn't doing it alone, you're not doing it alone, she did have help, but for me, she seems so lonely. She seems so lonely to me, even though like she has 2 kids and she's like in New York City. Like these pages felt really, really lonely to me.
So do you think she would have been better off if she stayed with her parents and stayed, you know, at her ancestral home? Or
I do.
I don't. So I think the loneliness is coming from the fact that she is separated from a sense of spirituality, which is why once she returns to it, things start to pick up for her in a sense. I don't think that was moving towards a white life. I think that she's moving toward, like, I think that she's living a Black life, right? I think this is not a Black versus white. I think this is an African experience that her mother's mother represented, that Mati represented, that Fela represented. There's a white experience that none of them do. But then there is, what does it mean to be Black, right? Which is to be of African descent, but away from the continent. What does it mean to be a diasporic Black person? And so that's really what I was sitting with.
Yeah, I didn't get any of that because the Blackness never faded for me. The Blackness never faded for me. The transition from the earth to the concrete. That's what I mean by white life. I don't mean really white people and like biscuits and scones. I mean like from the earth to the concrete. That transition to me feels, there's something, I don't know, between the lines that's not being said. There's something so cold and there's a loneliness there.
Yeah, that's America. That's coming to America. That's what it's all about. And I think that kind of duality, for lack of a better word, from coming from this lush country to a place where if you don't live close to a park, you're going to see concrete all day, every day, you know. So that's a stark difference, you know, to come from a place where it's all green to a place where it is all concrete, and everything is based on capitalism. So from sun up to sundown, you got to go to work, and you got to get on the gray train, and you got to walk down the gray sidewalk. You got to sit in a gray chair. So,
So that to me sounds like I was gonna say that sounds like an urban experience. And it's kind of like concrete, like, I guess I think there's a binary here that I think is kind of, it's not like it's kind of, how can I say it, collapsing some things. I think if we look at it from that way, we might be overlooking certain things.
Like what?
So thinking about, you know, concrete not representing a Blackness, I think, like, who made the streets? Like, who made the sidewalks? And so I think that's where I'm troubled, because I really think that Elena's lack is coming from being out of touch with her ancestors.
And she's also in love with Pedro, still.
I think there's also like an ideological shift though too. I think when you were talking about America, I think, you know, usually mainland USA is all about the individual. It's all about being very independent. You know, it's about the self-made, self-servicing, immediate gratification for the self. And I think that in a lot of ways, she was also making that shift as well in you know, the major part of her journey was she needed to strike out for herself because she was having such a terrible experience at home with Pedro and his mother. So I think that there was sort of a shift that she was making somewhat in her mindset. I don't want to say 100% because she does return to the stone, and she does kind of regain some of her spiritual and ancestral roots. But there is, like, when she's going from Puerto Rico to mainland USA, there's something that happens to her in that move. That is more kind of represented when we think about America, when we think about the individual, when we think about the self. That's very, very represented here.
Also, keep in mind that this is a new reality for Elena, but it was a new reality for thousands, because at that time, people were leaving the island by the thousands.
A million people. A million Puerto Ricans left Puerto Rico in the mid-40s.
And if the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, I mean, there were more Puerto Ricans in New York than there were on, on the island at one point. So she wasn't alone in terms of not having, she was alone, she was in a new situation, in a new reality, but she didn't act out of the clear blue. There were people that she knew, and when I think about it, when I'm on the island, people say about people coming into the mainland, they say, se fueron pa fuera. They went outside. And so this going pa fuera means that you're leaving the nest, you're leaving, the homeland, and you're going out into the world. And she went pa fuera, but she wasn't alone. So I didn't have that sense that she was going to be so lonely, because she had friends, and she was going to make new friends, and she was going to rely on the networks that already were existing in New York City to help her find a job, to help her find a place to live, to get her set up. And so I didn't quite get that sense of her being alone. I mean, she didn't have her husband, and in that sense, she was really striking out on her own. But I really felt that she had a sense that there was support for her, no matter what her decision was going to be.
I saw that, I saw it more as, here, and I don't know if anyone has experienced this, but you make this move, you're strongly independent, you're assured of yourself, but then there are these moments of doubt, and I that's what I felt from her, that she knows what she wants, she's very independent, but like any normal human being, there is this moment that you feel very alone with the decisions that you've made. And you can be surrounded by as many people as you can possibly be surrounded by, but you feel very alone in the decision that you've made. You just feel very alone. And I think it's, couple that with the fact that here she's in this country by herself with 2 children, that now she has to figure out how she's going to provide and support these 2 children, not knowing that whether her husband is going to join her at all. So to me, it's like, I mean, I just talk about myself personally, I feel that I'm an independent person, and I've made these decisions. And then when I make them, in the moment of it, I'm like, I feel very alone and sort of frightened about the decision that I've made, and unsure. And so she clung to, to the people that could offer her the comfort, and that's her children. So that's the way I interpret it. And I took, I related it to a very personal experience, and I connected with how she felt at that moment, because, it was very relevant to something in my life. So
I think that maybe also just the fact of how the difference between like how Cheyenne said, she left in this badass linen suit with high heels, but then when she's actually in New York at the airport, she's nobody's listening to her. She can't find, she forgets about her luggage. They describe her as she has streaks of makeup. People are looking at her like she's crazy. So I feel that in itself created a really strong sense of loneliness, because of the fact that none of these people see her for the woman that she is, around all the people that love and support her in Puerto Rico, I guess. And then also I feel the only time I see that loneliness really broken is first when Pedro gets there, but then she's oh, this is a ghost living in my house. He didn't even seem like he really wanted to be there. He seems like it was like a form of resignation that he came to New York in the first place. But then when her daughter starts talking about the stone and starts talking about like all these things and opening up to her mom and like helping her mom with things, I feel like that's the only time where that sense is like broken, when they start connecting to that spirituality again and kind of like helping out her mother the way that she helped her mother when she was in the hospital. So
yes, that's exactly what I wrote down. I was thinking, because like at the beginning, it's like this beautiful kind of like development, like that we're reading, right? Because between all of these women, and I mean, I did think it was strange though that two things I want to bring to the circle. One, that this idea of like women, either, I guess at the beginning of the book, it was kind of all these older women, Tia Josefa, and like these just like older women, Mati and her daughter, like kind of catering to their children or to their seeds. And now, like in this chapter, it's reversed, right? So that's one thing I kind of wanted to bring into the circle, like that kind of what happened, you know, when that mother-daughter or caregiver-child relationship is reversed, and like the child is now the teacher, becomes the teacher, and things like that. And I really truly felt like her daughter was kind of the ancestor in that sense, like the ancestor being manifested in that sense. So that's one thing I wanted to bring in the circle. The second thing is in chapter 21, or may have been when, I think it was 21, when Elena is talking about Pedro, and she's like justifying almost like why he left, and maybe he was right in lashing out at her, and there's this like long paragraph of her like battling with this like love that she has for him. And I thought about loneliness there too, because that's what loneliness makes you do, right? It leads you into making excuses for other people's behavior. So there were so many kind of points like that for me. That's why I kind of like the theme for me was loneliness in these pages, because it wasn't necessarily like blatant loneliness. It was the action that she was doing that kind of showed her loneliness, like called her out. She called herself out in a sense.
yeah, I feel like it also helps to know like the fact that we know her mother's story and the women before her brings a lot of like a generational trauma kind of like sense into it, because of the fact that like think about it, like Elena had to take care of her mother when her mother was literally in the hospital not speaking, and now you have Carissa doing that without even really like thinking about it, and like kind of thinking about how these effects of like undergoing like a serious like cognitive dissonance where like you literally have to take care of your mother. You have to do it. It doesn't matter if you agree with her or not. Like I feel like that's a lot of the sense of like trying to rationalize other people's decisions and not feeling like yourself, like not feeling like you have a self, like because you're giving out all of your like love and attention to like the people that are around you. And that's what I got from like pretty much this whole book so far. So I think it's interesting how that like really shows itself without even really needing to be said. So
anyone else want to chime in? You're muted. You're muted, Fela. Oh wait, maybe she's not talking to us.
Oh yeah, she's.
Okay, thanks guys.
Everyone, remember that you may be muted when you start speaking, so you can just unmute yourself before you chime in. Go ahead, Twyla.
Okay, thank you guys. One thing that was particularly difficult for me, this sense that Pedro, he was able to blame her so unilaterally. And it just disturbed me. I couldn't get past it. I know in the book we have a lot of characters, they're flawed, they're imperfect. We see redeeming good qualities and sometimes things that may disturb us. But I did not understand how he could seem to cast all the blame on her and not explore where he may have fallen short as a husband, as a father, to create a safe space for her in their home. And because to me, they never seem to quite get to the heart of it and explore that on a deeper level that I think was necessary to truly mend their marriage. Instead, he kind of lived with it. She was almost seemingly grateful that he came back and shared his presence with her. And that bothered me.
Ain't that just like a man though? Like,
Yup.
man.
Yup.
Not you, Ron. Not you. But
Not you, Ron, but
Thank you.
yes, don't get me going. Yep. Thank you. I was just about to type it down, but you said it all. So isn't that typical like it? Yeah. Okay. So we don't need to say anything else, right, Ron?
And one thing
I mean, really.
I do want to add, I don't think that that is a quality unique to men. I mean, I've known some really know and love some wonderful men, but that was a deep character flaw, I think, with Pedro, and I just could not really get past it. So.
Percent agree. That is
But I think Pedro's mom set him up. I mean, to be that kind of man. So
I think it's just very easy to internalize patriarchal bullcrap. It's too easy. Like the mom, Pedro, like all of this, like, the fact that we live in societies where the man is considered the center of the universe and should be the superior. We all have to defer to the man and whatever he has to say. Like, it's very, very easy to internalize all of those messages and be like Pedro's mom or be like Pedro. Like, it's just very, very easy.
Keep in mind, this is pre-women's studies. All right? But just,
I think women's studies have been going on since women have been here.
No, I don't buy that.
Wait. So
No.
everyone wasn't as enlightened as we are today. That's my point.
Right.
So
She didn't write this she didn't write this in the 1940s. She was the author.
But she was writing about that era.
But I still, even though probably women and men did not have the language or the vocabulary that we have now around these things, they can definitely name it. And I think Elena named it for herself and was like, this is not right. This ain't, I gotta leave. Like, this is not the way it should be. And she knew that in her heart, even though she didn't have the words for it. But, it's you can definitely have the experience without having like the kind of the framings that we have for things now. And you can have the experience without going through a women's studies course.
Yeah, I mean, like, it just seems like Pedro's mom was like using him as a vessel to exert control over her grandchildren. Like I even saw, like, I noticed how she wouldn't let the kids call her like abuela. She made them call her mama grande instead, which was like exerting complete control over like Elena. Yeah. And I just feel like it's so interesting to see how, like, when Elena took care of her mom, like in the hospital, like Concha had no idea that she was like going to go through such a experience where she didn't know what was going on around her. And Elena had to be the one to feed reality to her. So now she's being fed this reality and then she had, like, it's so incredible to me that she had the strength and the knowledge to be like, yeah, what this lady is saying is like not correct, because I have had to live and relay this reality to my mother, that her, like, what was going on around her. So like, I'm so secure in what I know about myself and what life is supposed to be like, and this is not it. I feel like that was just such an incredible show of strength. And she had, and when she got to New York, like, of course, like, anyone would falter at that, like, having this sense of reality that she knew about Puerto Rico be completely removed from her. And like, I feel like that just brought her back into this space where she felt like she needed Pedro, and that if he was, as long as he was around, even if he was constantly blaming her, it was like more than nothing. Like, it was better than nothing, I guess.
I found this passage, it's a very short paragraph on 212, chapter 19, really sad. When Elena watched the children, arms around each other, gently snoring, she envied them, their closeness. In spite of all the scenes of the many arguments that had forced her to flee that house, she still loved Pedro and longed for his warmth.
Mm.
So a few pages after that, actually, I'm not quite sure what your numbers are, but a few pages after that, it gets even sadder, right? And she starts like holding the babies, and she's like trying not to cry. And this was tricky for me. Did anyone have anything else to add? I'm sorry. Okay. Thank you for reading that, Cheyenne. And this part was tricky for me. Especially when she kind of starts journaling. That's when you really get to see her like battling with her insecurities and battling with her relationship with Pedro. And to me, especially in those diary entries, what's being said is that like the children are asking for Pedro, right? The children are wondering where Pedro is. She's like, I don't think she's making excuses for him, but I think that she has taken on, in kind of like the pages that she's writing, I think she really takes on kind of like in her mind, I think that's where she figures out that she will now have to be the mother and the father. That Pedro, he ain't got it. If it's not in him, he ain't got it. Even though she's not being rude to him, she's being like kind, and she's talking about the children a lot. I think that's when she's like really realizing that, oh wait, hold on. Even though like I love Pedro, like I'm supporting these children myself. This is my job. I don't have any help. I'm mom and dad. Do you guys know what I'm saying?
She's the mom. She's the single mom.
Yeah, even when Pedro showed up, I mean, he wasn't there.
Yeah.
And he wasn't there for a very long time. And when their son died, I mean, I think it just exacerbated things. Yeah. Okay, this is me being somewhat evil. I kind of liked it when he was brought down a rung down on the ladder. When he was looking for a job, he thought automatically, I'm going to come to New York, I'm going to get this job in this really fancy office. And he quickly realized that wasn't in the cards for him. He was going out to interviews and not getting anything. And he kept rejecting. I think her friend's husband was offering him a job to do like manual labor, and he was rejecting that, but still going out to these interviews. And then he eventually had to take this manual labor job. I kind of was like, yes. Like he had to be brought down a rung or two, even though it is, yes, I think, you know, he could have been going out to these interviews and being discriminated and been discriminated against because of his color, because of, you know, coming from not mainland USA. So that is bad, but also I kind of secretly kind of cheered a little bit when he eventually had to take that job that he was trying to reject.
You know, and you know why?
Because, and that makes me a little evil, and I know that.
Well, maybe, but I wasn't thinking of it in those terms. I guess I wasn't thinking of it kind of how you are, like, yes, he got what he deserved. You know, I was kind of like, okay, finally, you know, maybe she'll see that him coming ain't good news. You know what I'm saying? Remember when she got the telegram and she's like, oh, telegrams are always bad news. And that one was, and then she like got one right before he came, like, oh, this was finally good news that Pedro's coming. And it's like, nah, you don't need him. He ain't even gonna get a job, you know, like he's gonna be picking and choosing which jobs he wants. Like you don't need him. So yeah, I think that like I cheered a little bit when she finally, I'm sorry, someone was saying something. No? You don't hear anything? I feel you on that. I mean, what
But I think also in general, the fact that Elena's experience in the job world was very, very sad. You know, she had all of these credentials to be a nurse, and she only could get a nurse's aide position, and they were giving her the worst kind of tasks and jobs to do. Yeah. I think it's very kind of in line with a lot of immigrant stories that I've heard, even my mom and my dad, who my dad went through college in Nigeria, coming here, had to get whatever little job that he could get, and his credentials, even to this day, are still not kind of validated in the same way, or, you know, valued in the same way, because, you know, they're, you know, he's from Nigeria. But Nigeria has kind of one of the best educational systems, especially when it comes up to math and sciences. But, you know, to have that experience of not having, you know, all of the work that you've done in your country, all of that, not being seen the same way or valued in the same way is, you know, terrible. It's horrible. So I do want to say that and put that in space as well.
I mean, I'm glad you brought that to the space, because it's funny you say that. And I kept going back to the earth, and I kept thinking, like, I mean, maybe this is another sign, you know, maybe will be another sign from her, especially when she talks about like getting her first paycheck and finally being able to like pay bills and put food on the table. I thought about that a lot, because I almost forgot she was like a trained nurse. You know, I almost forgot when I was reading these pages. And I kind of thought about that the same way you're thinking about it, in the sense that like with all of this training, you're getting the worst shifts at your job. And not only are you getting the worst shifts, everyone's kind of looking down on you that works there. Staying at home meant a lot to me during this entire book, like staying where you're at, and I've never thought that. I've traveled so many places. I left home when I was like 17, like it's not how but for some reason, in these pages with these women, I want them to stay put. Like I want them just like to be safe and stay where they are, you know? I don't know what that is. But when she finally did get the paycheck, I was happy, but I was kind of like, you know, see, maybe it ain't all good in New York. Maybe the streets aren't paved with gold in America.
They never have been.
Yeah, they never have been.
They never have been.
So but you see what I'm saying?
That American dream that is sold to us is so fragile and so tenuous that you can't even measure the percent. It's so small of people who migrate here and live, you know, the quote unquote American dream. It's probably higher now, but I'm sure back in the 50s and 60s, it was a nearly impossible dream to attain, despite or in spite of what is sold to you when you are thinking of coming to this country.
The other part,
even if you're in this country and you know, live in certain places.
On the other hand, there was always, I think among my family and among many Puerto Ricans, there was always this dream of once you retire, you're going back home. And that's not the case for many immigrants. For many immigrants, that's not an option. But for many Puerto Ricans, it was me retiro y me voy. I'm going to retire and I'm going back home. So being in the States, being in New York was a reality in order to make money and feed your family. But once you met those requirements and you had an income that you didn't have to work from 5 in the morning till 10 at night, then you can go home. And even if you bought yourself a little piece of land and you built a wooden shack, that was fine, because that was home. You were going back home. And I found that for other people that come here from outside of the United States, that's not always their plan. And therefore the assimilation, the need to assimilate is so much greater. And I haven't found that among second generation, third, so much Puerto Ricans. But it's my personal experience. It may not be true for all, but there was that first generation that came here, it was my experience that they always wanted to go back home.
What's interesting is that so as a non-first or second generation Puerto Rican who is friends with other folks who are not first or second gen, I know a number of people who are attempting to make an income in Puerto Rico doing freelance work. These are young people in their 30s, and then their 40s. So it's interesting, right? Like they're not going there to retire, they're going there to feel closer to their homeland, and to attempt to make an income for themselves as opposed to retiring. It's interesting. It's an interesting pattern.
Are they successful, Cheyenne?
They're, they're struggling because there really isn't, there really isn't work there. So they are having to rely on the networks that they have created and built in the States, and relying on them to generate different projects and different sources of money while in Puerto Rico.
I have, it's Viv. As a first generation New York Puerto Rican, the way, my parents, like she said earlier, how you come to New York City from Puerto Rico and your dream is you always want to go back and you want to retire. The attitude there was, it's like, let's buy you want to own where you live in New York and you want to own where you live in Puerto Rico. So then the next generation, what we did is we did guest houses, we did inns, we did not a traditional formal hotel, but we had rentals. And it's like, so now my cousins that are maybe 10 years older than me, but they were first generation Puerto Ricans, their kids are now in their 20s and 30s. And before Maria, they were doing that. They were trying to go back to Puerto Rico, and how can I make an income without living there? So then they were able to tap in with the first generation and say, let's take some of your Airbnb, let's take some of your hotels and do spa retreats. Let's do that kind of thing. But once Hurricane Maria hit, it all went out the window. So now you have all these pieces of property with grass as high as a person, because it's just crumbled after the hurricane. And it's a really, it's a discussion that we have regularly. It's like, how do you go back home? Or how, we have the flexibility to go back and forth, but how do you, trying to revive that economy has been a nightmare after the hurricane.
But I would even, again, connect that back to the American dream, and how tenuous it is for non-white communities. Even though Puerto Ricans are very much American, sometimes I think that Black and brown people are more American than anyone else. But it is so fragile to live outside of this system. And as beautiful, I've never been to Puerto Rico, but I've been to other islands, and as beautiful as they are, they've never had a sustainable economy, because except for a few years, maybe like after slavery, but once that whole slavery structure ended, which didn't end like, one day, it was just over. It lasted for decades after, indentured servitude and what do they call the farms?
Sharecroppers.
Agricultural.
Right. And then after that, there's all this racism that, extends far beyond that. So it's really hard to, just kind of engage the American dream for Black and brown people, whether you stay home or whether you migrate here.
It was never FUBU. It was never for us, by us. So that's why it doesn't work.
And Pedro and, I'm sorry, I'm drawing, Elena was her name? They both kind of reflect that in their experience, coming here. It's still like a hard scrapple life. And, the sad part is they lose a child, which kind of like sets them, off on a different path, actually a path to probably reconciling, but it's still kind of a sad path. Which, by the way, as a side, to kind of critique the book and the author, I thought the death of that child was just, it felt like too much of a plot device, just to change the angle of this relationship so Pedro and Elena can get back together. There wasn't enough history given to that child's illness, or I know the boy suddenly gets sick and then he's dead.
Yeah.
Maybe I needed more history, more lead-in, not that I wanted him to suffer or be sick for a long period of time, but it just felt like I'm gonna put this here so that the two main characters can use this like as a device for them to kind of start bumping back together again.
So let me ask you this,
Yeah,
Ryan. Would it make a difference if they separated after that for you?
I mean, they almost did separate. I felt like it would. I wanted Elena not to love him. I wanted Elena not to love Pedro after all the crap that you know, she had to put up with. To me, I'm gonna go back to my earlier point. He decided, Pedro, between his mother and his wife, and he chose his mother. That is crazy to me. And it's not like he decided between one woman or another. He decided between his wife, who has 2 children, and his mom. To me, that's unforgivable. Like, there's no redemption for Pedro, to me. So I wanted her to meet some nice dude in the Bronx or wherever they were living at the time and set her off at a different angle. That's what I wanted, but that's me.
I actually thought the death of the child was most certainly going to separate them. Because then I was like, oh, okay, well, now Pedro has a real solid reason to go back to mama, you know, like.
Yeah.
But I saw the death of the child. I saw the death of the child, of what happened with Fela and Mati. It's almost like they each had to be punished for something that they did. And for Elena, it was, you know, losing the baby. And that was her punishment for standing up for herself and taking a step that she shouldn't have, in whoever minds, you know, decide what's right and wrong. So it's almost like every single woman in this line of family has to be punished for something or other. And for Elena, it was this baby.
Fascinating. I wrote that down too. Like every woman we meet loses a child. Almost every woman that we're following child in some way or another. Does anyone else want to piggyback off of what Evelyn just said?
I'm just thinking, now that you brought that up, each woman suffers loss through death. And each of those traumatic experiences shakes her up and then kind of initiates a change in her. From Fela's death leads to Mati's giving life to Mati, but then Mati's death shakes up Elena, and then when what's her name? Mati's daughter,
Carissa.
No. Concha.
Yeah, Concha.
When she's in a very debil state, then Elena kind of is forced to move forward. But then there's still conflict. But it's sort of like those are moments of forcing people to change in some way. I don't know, just thinking about that.
I agree with you. I guess I was thinking about, I didn't think of it in that way. I thought of it in that way, but I was thinking a lot about Tia Josefa and how she lost twice, or really almost 3 times, but really twice with Fela. It's like young girl that came, that she was the only one that she would talk to, or not talk to, but kind of bled close to her, and she lost her. And then when Mati came, she raised Mati, and then Mati is a super independent, you know, woman, that amazing woman. But there were a few times I remember reading where Tia Josefa expressed, like, you know, the pain that she had for having to let Mati go, you know, having to raise this like beautiful, strong woman and like knowing that you had to let her go in that sense. So I thought a lot about Tia Josefa and about how she struggled. Every woman kind of lost something through death, like you said, but Tia Josefa struggled twice to me. I don't know. There's something there about Tia to me.
I thought more simply, I think I was just saying that the death of Elena's son just really cleared a pathway for Carissa and Carissa's story and her relationship with her story, her relationship with her mother. I think it really, you know, she had the opportunity to kind of take on some of the characteristics or the qualities that Elena, even the role that Elena took on when Concha, her mother, when Concha was sick, she kind of took on that role with the death of her brother. And it really kind of brought Elena, I didn't really factor Pedro into that whole dynamic. I really just saw it as Elena and Carissa becoming closer. And then Carissa actually had a voice, like she had more of a voice once her brother died. And, you know, and also very simply in other chapters, you only see a mother and daughter. Like you don't see these women having any other kids. Like they don't have no other kids, but just one daughter. So I think that was just,
which I found a little strange.
It was like a convenient thing. I don't know, which sounds terrible, but
Ron's point, right? That goes back to Ron's point, the convenience that the writer is kind of taking. What were you saying, Cheyenne?
Yeah, I'm glad you bring up the fact that they each only have like one child, because that is very unusual given the lack of birth control in that time period. I'm like, just speaking from like my own family, like my great grandmother had like 6, 7 children, and I know folks had way more than that. And I'm just like, how y'all only having one kid?
Right.
How is Elena in the 1950s?
Right, yeah.
How is she the only one who has 2 children? I'm like, what is going on? But I do like the fact that we're talking about grief, because speaking personally, I know that whenever I've experienced a major loss, they say, you know, death is a great equalizer. It really it really forces you to confront things that maybe you were trying to avoid. And I think, yeah, it's been interesting to see the different women characters when they are grieving, their response to it.
I kind of thought that maybe it was sort of like a thing with the goddess, that there only could be the one child, this one female child going forward. I kind of saw it as part of the fable or the myth of the whole thing. That just sort of the way I thought maybe the fact that the baby died, that would have just happened no matter what, because it could only be the one woman going forward.
Oh,
I may have just read that into it. I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting because that was the same relationship that I was building in my mind. That starts out with, I forgot her name, the first lady who gave birth
Fela.
To Fela, right? It starts out with her, and there's to me is this ever-present feeling of this goddess being very intertwined in their life. And it was interesting that it was the boy who passed away and not the girl. And there's always this overriding relationship between the mother and the child, both females. But I always see it tying into Ochun, which is the goddess, and the presence of how Ochun is so present in these women's life. And part of Ochun's characteristic is to be a very fiercely independent, strong-willed, very strong-willed woman. And all of these women, even with the little girl Carissa now, they display this real sense of independence and strength. And this whole bringing back of the stone and the spirituality is very, very much tied into Ochun, which is the goddess that comes out very early in the novel. So I always see it just really tying back to the whole story and the relationship and some of the challenges and struggles and successes that these women experience is, to me, tied very deeply into this goddess. And I would be really curious to find out from the author what her relationship is with the goddess herself, with Ochun, because I have a very strong indication that she, that she has a very strong connection to this goddess in this world of deities or goddesses.
And Dahlma Llanos-Figueroa will be with us next week, so she'll join the chat next week. So save your question.
Save your questions. You know, I'm kind of really stopped by what you just said. Was it Nancy?
Yes.
You know, because I didn't think about that. How she didn't get her spirituality back until, because I said this before, like once the men leave, things start looking a little better. Sorry, Ron. But like once the male child died, it was not for me so much as kind of like a writer's ploy to get the two lovers back together, but it was like more of a ploy to get the woman back connected to her spirituality.
And to fulfill whatever mission it is, because I always felt that Fela came, when she came into the world, into this story, to this book, was to fulfill a mission. And I feel that these women have these missions that is part of the fabric of who they are, and they have to succeed at these missions.
And I agree with you. I guess I was just wondering about men a lot in the sense of, do they not have these missions? Are they not capable of these missions? No men have any missions in this book. Like they are giving no task. They are not capable.
I think that in the world of the god and goddesses, they do, but this is her story. This is Ochun's story.
And it is purposeful about, portraying women. So I don't know how much space you can give to the development of each male character if you are trying to move along the book around this sort of female-centric storyline. If everyone has like a background story, this book is now like 700 pages.
No, but Ron, listen to me when I say like, even if the men didn't have background stories, they're still not very capable. They're still not very capable.
That's most men.
Ouch. Speak on it. Speak on it.
It's the story from the woman's perspective, but it's also, I think, she's using the connection to, it's Daughters of the Stone, and the stone represents Ochun. Ochun represents the tie to Africa, but also just their history, the family history. And so it's the women who keep coming back to that stone. I think, when does Elena find the stone in the back of the closet? And then she realizes, oh, I haven't touched this for a while. And then that kind of motivates her. So it's kind of like it's spirituality because it's a deity, it's an orisha, but it's also a connection to history and a history of resilience and resistance. And that's what I feel like keeps coming through each generation of
And I see as Oshun is a goddess of fertility, and through Oshun, her generations will continue. So that's how I see this Oshun very prominent, because that's how the future generations will keep going.
Yeah, she's known to, when women are pregnant, she's known to women to pray to her for fertility and for a happy, safe birth and pregnancy. So you're right. Sensuality, sexuality, and fertility are tied into it, and it runs through the story of all of these women, right?
That's right.
Sensuality, sexuality, independence, love, and fertility. So, so she's known to be a goddess that women will pray to if they wish to be fertile. And once they are impregnated, they're pregnant, then they pray to her for the safeguarding and safekeeping of their child. Yeah.
I think that's why I was confused that they didn't have more children in the book, since Oshun is a goddess of fertility. But now that I think about it, really, the story of Fela is that that was a fertility ritual that she was not able to complete. And so I think, again, you know, that initial point in their lineage where it's this moment that wasn't fulfilled at the time that they had intended to, and she has to endure an amount of pain to get to a point where she fulfills it. I think there's something about that there.
I also noticed she was praying, doing Hail Marys and doing Catholic prayers for the baby, and the baby died. And then after that, she started getting the dreams back, and Carissa told her the woman came and said, you have to find the stone. So it's almost like she kind of switched religions when the baby died, or came back more to the stone and the dreams.
So this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the failure, number one, of this kind of movement, of these movements to America, and also kind of like the colorlessness of her life in America, this kind of like praying to these, in this like European Catholic like way, and getting no responses, right? Not getting any response, but the baby dying. And then that clicking back into you like, no, that's not you. You got to go back home. Oh, it's 8:30. Ladies.
Wow.
This was such a great discussion. I just want to dive into it.